When I first started thinking about making a sawhorse to cut firewood, there was a few things that I wanted to achieve with it. One of them was to get the logs and wood I was cutting off the ground. First, to protect the chain on the chainsaw from getting into rocks and dirt. The other was to protect the lower back. So if you could raise the log up a little bit, you wouldn't be bent over quite so far or having to squat, and it would be less tiring for your lower back. The other thing that also was a problem is when you have short logs that you need to cut up. And I'm talking about logs that would make 2 pieces of firewood or even 1.5. Holding them with your foot on the ground is quite dangerous because the saw is getting very close to your leg and your foot. So having some experience working in construction and woodworking when I was younger, I'd seen a few different types of workhorses, sawhorses for that type of work. And I proceeded to experiment with a couple simple designs, models that I slapped together with some scrap lumber and tried them out, but the results weren't very satisfactory. So then I went on the internet and decided to see what was available for sale. Sometimes that's a good way to get an idea on how to make something for yourself. The only things that I found that were available were geared towards people that were doing firewood as a business. And this equipment was, quite large, heavy duty, and not really something suitable. And it also worked together with other wood cutting machinery, so I didn't have much luck there. So I tried to find on the internet to see if anybody else had built anything themselves. The only thing I found, and this really was a key part of inspiring this idea, was a man that basically took 2 pieces of plywood and attached them together, not too strongly, just in a 90-degree. He cut some slots into the plywood at the measurements of where he wanted, what length of firewood that he wanted, and he was explaining that he used it as a gauge. He was using it on the ground. He used it as a gauge to speed up, so you didn't have to measure or eyeball it. You could just cut quickly, and I thought that was a really good idea. So I took that and then incorporated that into what you see here now that I've built. Now, I will explain the details of why I built it the way I did. So the first thing that I'd like to tell you about is the legs. Now, this is very important. I used the A-frame design to increase stability. If you had straight legs coming down, it would be very unstable and would topple over one way or the other quite easily. That's really dangerous because you're holding on to a chainsaw that has a sharp chain on it, and if anything would happen that you would fall over, you would certainly get seriously injured. So the thing though with the A-frame is you have to take in mind it can't be too wide, because you're working back here, okay? You're walking along as you're cutting your logs, and it creates a tripping hazard. So you have to consider that problem, because you don't want to be tripping with a running chainsaw in your hand either. The next thing that I'd like to point out, and this is also very important, I made this to be able to put very heavy logs on the sawhorse. So you need to have cross bracing going down to your legs and coming up to the work table that you created, so that when you put a heavy log on it, it can't fold. The legs can't fold, and it collapses that way. That's also a very dangerous situation. The width of the sawhorse can be made to custom fit use the length of your cutter bar on your chainsaw. I have an 18-inch cutter bar on mine, and I made the table. You can see the end of the saw barely sticks out past the 2x6s on the base. Now, the next important feature here is for where the logs actually sit on. As you can see with this log here, I used 2x6s here where to create the space where the chainsaw can come down past the log. It's not just for that reason. If you have a bent log, and as you've experienced, and you're cutting it, as you get closer to the bottom and finishing the cut, the log will collapse and pinch the chainsaw in the log. So with 2x6s here, there's enough space that you can go down just to the point where the log begins to collapse or gets ready to pinch your chainsaw bar. You can pull the chainsaw out and slide it in from underneath, from behind, and then cut up, and that avoids the whole binding of the chainsaw. I just want to say too, if I was going to rebuild this or make a new one, I would increase the gap in between these two 2x6s. Originally, I thought this would be good enough, but as you can see here, I've hit these 2x4s, 2x6s quite often, and I would increase this gap to maybe 1.5 inches. You could even go 2 inches. When you're attaching these pieces, you do have to keep in mind that your saw will make contact with this wood. So when you go to screw it together, make sure that you put your screws to the farthest point outside. So like 3/4 of the way to the outer edge here, so that when you do make contact with this wood, you're not going to hit a screw right away. The other thing also is to, when you attach your legs and your cross braces and all that, make sure you're not putting screws in where you're going to have the space for the saw, so that you're not hitting any screw heads with the chainsaw. It goes the same for the plywood. It's probably a little hard to see because we're kind of looking into the sun, and this is in the shadow right here, but the same, when you put your screws in to support your plywood, make sure they are 3/4 of the way into your 2x6, so that when you do hit this plywood, you're not going to go directly in the screw. Now, the height of your sawhorse should be made to your comfort. I'm 6 feet 2 inches tall, so I made mine tall enough that I could keep a straight posture and bend a little knee if I had to, but it works very nice for me. So you'll have to figure out with the working deck how long you'll have to make your legs, and so that it's at the best working height for you. You want to be able to get the saw into the slot without lifting it too high, and you want to be getting through your log before you have to stoop or bend or whatever you're going to do too low. Now, another feature is, so before I tell you that feature, this tool is probably more suited for people who have piles of logs. If you're cutting a whole bunch of small logs, or if you're cutting up the scraps from lumber milling, You can stack a lot. I've stacked those things all the way up to the top of the the plywood back here, and it allows you to cut a lot of wood with a single cut. So the next feature is for when you're cutting multiple pieces, multiple small pieces. What happens is when you're, especially with round logs, as you start cutting, and they're not perfectly straight and everything, once the pieces come loose, they want to have a tendency to roll off of the sawhorse. So to prevent that, I just made some simple rods that you stick into holes. That one's jammed with a piece of wood. You just simply slide them into the holes. Wherever they're needed. And once the pieces become loose, they can't roll off. What you do not want to do is put these in and stack your wood with pressure against these rods, because what's going to happen is as you cut through, the pieces are going to begin to settle, and you're getting back into the problem of getting your saw, the cutter bar, pinched between pieces of wood. So yeah, so stack your wood and put these in afterwards, just to prevent the things from rolling or falling off. It also works good with the, as I said, the scraps from sawmilling, because a lot of the scraps are rounded, so you can stack them up quite high, but the pile will be unstable, and once you start cutting, it'll want to fall off. So you can just put rods wherever it's needed. One thing that I forgot to mention also for safety, when you're cutting, especially the sawmill lumber scraps, it happens occasionally with small pieces of log too, but when you're cutting and you end up with a small piece, either a very short piece or a very thin piece that's very light, because as you're going down with the chainsaw, the top of the chain is going away from you, and I often have someone working with me when I'm doing this. So while you're cutting, you don't want anybody standing in front of the workhorse, because I've seen the saw throw small pieces of wood quite hard and quite far, and you don't want somebody to get hit while you're cutting that. As I mentioned earlier, if I were to make a new one or rebuild this one, I would increase the space between these 2x6s. The other thing that I would do is I would increase the length of the workhorse by 2 sections, mainly because of the length of logs and wood that I'm cutting. I found that they're often too long for the workhorse, or they are, when you're dealing with the shorter ones, now with this log here, I don't have very much space to put another short log. With 2 sections wider, it would give me a lot more space to put additional logs and increase the amount of wood I'm cutting per cutting session. Another nice thing also, whether you're using the rods or not, once you've cut several pieces of firewood that you've stacked here, when you go to unload it, it's quite easy to grab quite a good handful and put it on your wood pile or on your rack, whichever whatever you're doing with your wood after you've done cutting it. So you're not picking pieces up off the ground and bending over, and you're able to grab an armful because you can get your hand underneath here and grab a big armful and put it on your wood pile. So that's another bonus of having the space underneath and having the high table. So another thing that I would like to mention also is if you have really long logs, what I've done is just off to the side, I've piled up some pallets to the same height as the working surface here, and then put my log down so that the pallets would support it and keep it from tipping up here. I tried a sawhorse at the end, and it's not as good, because once you're done cutting your cuts, you can remove the firewood, and what I do is at that point you can come over, grab the log, and then slide it over to get it onto the horse. With a sawhorse, the sawhorse tends to tip over. So if you use skids, they have a fairly wide working surface, so the log can slide on that fairly easily, and you just make sure that the wood that is on top of the skid, that they run parallel with your work table, so that you're not trying to go across the bumps or the spaces in between those, and it makes it slide a lot easier. When I first made this and started using it, I didn't really realize how much time it was going to save, because you still have to put all your logs on here, but the amount of time that it saves is considerable. The other thing is I used to get very fatigued and lower back pain and stuff cutting firewood, and I've cut a good part of the day and stacked, and no fatigue, no pain, nothing in the lower back. So it's a really it doesn't just save time, but it protects your physical health, and I think that's really important.